In 1932, Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, wrote an essay describing a lost age of human history, a forgotten civilization of mighty kingdoms and empires, set at the end of the last ice age, after the sinking of Atlantis but before the rise of recorded civilization. He called it the Hyborian Age. But that civilization came crashing to an end with a geological catastrophe, devastating floods, and a final period of freezing cold and massive glaciers, a period we now call the Younger Dryas.
The Younger Dryas was a cataclysm.
The Younger Dryas.
The Younger Dryas.
The Younger Dryas impact theory.
That's the thing when it comes to the Younger Dryas, which
Maybe instead of the Younger Dryas, it should be called the Younger Wet Ass. What?
Following those cataclysmic events of the Younger Dryas, the signs of civilization that we see emerging are not the beginnings of civilization. They're a restarting of civilization that had existed before the cataclysm.
Howard probably didn't know the term Younger Dryas. It wouldn't be popularized until after his death. But the geological event it describes is exactly what he was writing about, and the sources he used to build his fictional world are the same sources that fuel modern speculations about lost civilizations, like those of researchers like Graham Hancock. Most people know Robert E. Howard as the creator of Conan the Barbarian, but Howard was doing something much more ambitious than writing adventure stories. Over nearly his entire career, from the early 1920s until his death in 1936, Howard was building a coherent fictional prehistory of the world. His different character series each focused on a different epoch. Call of Atlantis in the deep historic past, Conan in the Hyborian Age that followed the great cataclysm that sank Atlantis and Lemuria, Bran McMorn in the age of the Picts during Roman times. Even his Elizabethan-era character Solomon Kane encounters ruins from these earlier ages. Each series builds on the others. Names, places, and people recur over thousands of years of fictional history. It's what some of us have come to call the Howard-verse. Howard was doing deliberate, large-scale world-building years before Tolkien. And the backbone of this fictional universe was an essay Howard wrote in early 1932. It was titled The Hyborian Age. The Hyborian Age was never intended to be published, though eventually it did see print in rare fanzines a few years later. First in 1936, and then finally in its full form in 1938, in this incredibly rare publication that was put out by Forrest Ackerman and Donald Wollheim. And this is the first time the entire essay was published in full, along with the first map of the Hyborian Age. And that is a pretty rare piece of Howard memorabilia. The Hyborian Age essay was a reference document Howard wrote for himself to keep the history of his world straight. But he put serious work into it. It went through multiple drafts, and what started as a loose framework became a detailed fictional history spanning thousands of years. And what it describes should sound very familiar to anyone following the current debates about lost civilizations. Before we take a look at what Howard wrote, let me briefly take a look at what Graham Hancock has been arguing for the last 30 years. Graham Hancock is probably the most well-known proponent of the idea that an advanced civilization existed at the end of the last ice age. If you've listened to his multiple appearances on Joe Rogan, or watched Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix, or really spent any time on YouTube and some of the history-adjacent spaces, you've probably almost certainly encountered his ideas. In 1995, Hancock published Fingerprints of the Gods. His argument in that book was a bold one, that an advanced civilization existed thousands of years before the earliest known historical civilizations, and that it was destroyed by a catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age. The survivors scattered across the world, becoming the mysterious civilizing figures found in the mythology of cultures from Egypt to Peru. Hancock drew from a number of speculative history sources, but much of his original thesis was built on the work of Charles Hapgood. In the late 1950s, Hapgood proposed that the Earth's crust could undergo rapid, dramatic shifts, moving entire continents to new latitudes. He argued that Antarctica had once been in a temperate zone, home to an unknown civilization before a crustal displacement shifted it to the pole and buried it under miles of ice. The idea actually caught the attention of Albert Einstein, who was intrigued by it enough to write the foreword to his book, Earth's Shifting Crust, that came out in 1959. A few years later, Hapgood followed up with Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings in 1966. In this book, he analyzed a number of medieval and Renaissance-era maps that appeared to show the coastline of Antarctica before it was covered by ice. His argument was that these maps were copied from much older source maps created by an unknown civilization that had surveyed the continent when it was still ice-free. These two books became the foundation for Fingerprints of the Gods. But over the next 2 decades, Hancock's thesis evolved and he moved away from Hapgood's highly controversial crustal displacement model towards something a little bit more in the realm of plausibility. In 2015, Hancock published Magicians of the Gods, and this is where the Younger Dryas enters the picture. The Younger Dryas was a sudden return to glacial conditions at the very end of the last ice age, roughly 12,800 years ago. Just as the world was starting to warm up, temperatures suddenly plunged and stayed cold again for about 1,200 years before the warming resumed. Geologists have known about it for over a century, but what caused it has been debated ever since. In recent years, a controversial new hypothesis has emerged. A team of researchers proposed that fragments of a comet struck the North American ice sheet around 12,800 years ago, triggering catastrophic flooding and massive fires. In this model, the comet impact is what caused the Younger Dryas. When the Younger Dryas ended about 11,600 years ago, rapid warming caused more flooding as the remaining ice melted. Hancock seized on this hypothesis, arguing that these events, the impact, the flooding, the long winter, destroyed the advanced civilization he believes existed, and that the flood myths found in cultures around the world are memories of this catastrophe. Now, to be clear, Hancock's ideas are very controversial, as is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and we could do whole videos just on those topics if there's interest. But whether you agree with Hancock or not, these ideas have become enormously popular. Millions of people are now familiar with the Younger Dryas, and many of them believe that mainstream archaeology is ignoring or suppressing evidence of a lost chapter of human history, including mainstream archaeologists, presumably like myself. I can tell you, I'm not hiding anything. If I could find some lost civilization, it would be amazing, and it would make my career and make my day. But this idea of an advanced civilization destroyed by catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age didn't start with Hancock, and it didn't start with Charles Hapgood. The basic concept goes back to ancient times, but it was really one man in the late 19th century that truly popularized the idea. In 1882, a former congressman from Minnesota named Ignatius Donnelly published a book that changed everything. A book that more than any other shaped the popular conception of a lost civilization in the distant past, destroyed by a great cataclysm. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Donnelly took Plato's story of Atlantis and argued that it was based on a real place, a real advanced civilization, the source of all the great civilizations of the ancient world. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Mesoamerican, South Asian, all of them, according to Donnelly, were colonies or cultural descendants of Atlantis. When Atlantis was destroyed in a great cataclysm, survivors carried their knowledge to the four corners of the world. The gods and heroes of ancient mythology were actually the kings and queens of Atlantis, remembered in garbled form across the millennia. The book was a massive bestseller, going through dozens of printings within just a few years, and it essentially created the modern Atlantis genre. Every lost civilization theory that followed owes a debt to Donnelly, to some degree or another. Donnelly was essentially a Victorian-era Graham Hancock. Or maybe we should say Hancock is the 21st century Ignatius Donnelly. But Donnelly didn't stop there. The following year, he published Ragnarok, The Age of Fire and Gravel. And this one is particularly interesting in light of what we've just been talking about. In Ragnarok, Donnelly argued that the Earth had been struck by a giant comet in prehistoric times. The impact caused worldwide fires, floods, and a period of darkness. He believed that myths about world-destroying catastrophes found in cultures around the globe, including the Norse Ragnarok, were memories of this comet impact. A comet impact causing global catastrophe and the destruction of an earlier civilization in 1883, over a century before the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Now, Donnelly couldn't have known about the Younger Dryas. The geological evidence wouldn't emerge until a couple of decades later. But the framework he proposed, an advanced civilization destroyed by a comet impact, followed by a period of darkness and rebuilding, is remarkably similar to what Hancock argues today using modern geological evidence. By the early 20th century, Donnelly's ideas about Atlantis had become a part of the cultural landscape. Other writers, however, took those ideas in a very different direction. After Donnelly, the idea of Atlantis was enthusiastically embraced by the Theosophical movement. Helena Blavatsky incorporated Atlantis and an even older lost continent, Lemuria, into her grand esoteric cosmology. Yes. This is The Secret Doctrine. And yes, this is a first edition, although mine is in pretty rough shape. Literally, one of these volumes is held together with duct tape. One of my projects is going to be to have these rebound. But yes, this is the 1888 first edition of The Secret Doctrine by Helena Blavatsky. In The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky describes vast root races spanning millions of years, with Atlantis and Lemuria as homelands for successive stages of human, spiritual, and physical evolution. And her followers ran with it. Writers like William Scott Elliott took Donnelly's framework and expanded it into something even more fantastic, but also more readable and accessible to a popular audience. This is William Scott Elliott's The Story of Atlantis from 1895. His Atlanteans had airships, advanced technology, and psychic powers. Lemuria was home to giants with a third eye, root races spanning millions of years, cosmic cycles of civilization and destruction. And one of the more interesting things about this book, it included multiple beautiful fold-out maps of Atlantis and Lemuria. I'll show you one of these really quickly. So this wasn't archaeology, this was spiritual mythology on a grand scale. And it became enormously influential in occult circles. And it was also a major source of inspiration for early writers of science fiction and fantasy, including Edgar Rice Burroughs, the creator of Tarzan and John Carter of Mars, H.P. Lovecraft, and, of course, as we'll see, Robert E. Howard. In the 1920s, Lewis Spence, a Scottish mythologist, tried to pull the Atlantis hypothesis back down to Earth. His version of Atlantis wasn't a gleaming high-tech civilization, it was Paleolithic, a Stone Age culture, advanced for its time, but still a culture of stone tools and cave art. This was his first book on the subject, The Problem of Atlantis, which was published in 1924. His key argument was that the Cro-Magnon people, European early modern humans, as we refer to them today, who seemed to suddenly appear in the European archaeological record with their sophisticated cave paintings and advanced toolmaking, were actually refugees from a sinking Atlantis. Now, while his ideas weren't mainstream, Spence was at least trying to ground the Atlantis hypothesis in actual archaeological evidence, almost as a reaction to the more fantastic Theosophical version. These two branches of the Atlantis tradition, the fantastic and the grounded, both influenced the pulp fiction writers of the early 20th century. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, and Howard all drew from this material. But Howard engaged with it more deeply and more thoroughly than most people realize. In a letter to his friend Harold Preece, Howard discussed both versions of Atlantis directly. About Atlantis, I believe something of the sort existed, though I do not especially hold any theory about a high type of civilization existing there. In fact, I doubt that. But some continent was submerged away back, or some large body of land, for practically all peoples have legends about a flood. And the Cro-Magnons appeared suddenly in Europe, developed to a high state of primitive culture. The occultists say we are the fifth great subrace. They say the Atlanteans were highly developed. I doubt it. I think they were simply the ancestors of the Cro-Magnon man, who by some chance escaped the fate which overtook the rest of the tribes. So Howard found Spence's version more realistic, but he drew from them both, and he'd been playing with these themes since the very beginning of his writing career, years before he created Conan. His earlier character Kull was literally from a Stone Age Atlantis like that proposed by Spence, who became the king of an advanced antediluvian civilization like the Atlantis of Scott Elliott. The Lost Continent wasn't just a backdrop for Howard, it was a foundation for world building. When Howard sat down in 1932 to create the Hyborian Age, a fully developed fictional prehistory for the Conan stories, he was drawing on years of reading and thinking about lost civilizations, catastrophism, and the deep human past. The result was a remarkable achievement in fantasy world building. A lost epoch set in an interglacial period at the end of the last ice age, between the sinking of Atlantis and the rise of recorded civilization. A fictional world built on the same intellectual foundations that Graham Hancock would draw from over 60 years later. This is the essay where he laid it all out. Howard's Hyborian Age essay lays out a fictional history spanning thousands of years. And if you've been paying attention, the broad outline is going to sound very familiar. It begins with a great cataclysm. The pre-existing civilizations of an earlier age are wiped out. Atlantis sinks beneath the waves. The continent of Lemuria is destroyed. Entire kingdoms are obliterated virtually overnight. The survivors are reduced to barbarism, scattered across a reshaped world. Over the following millennia, new peoples slowly rebuild. Tribes of northern barbarians called the Hyborians migrate southward and establish new kingdoms. Aquilonia, Nemedia, Koth, Corinthia. A new civilization arises from the ruins of the old. This is the world of Conan the Barbarian. But it doesn't last. The Hyborian kingdoms eventually fall to invasions from all sides. Picts from the west, Turanians from the east. And from the north, the blonde-haired Aesir and the red-haired Vanir, driven south by what Howard calls the Glacier Ages. A final period of glaciation sweeping down from the Arctic, freezing everything in one last miniature ice age, just like the Younger Dryas. In the midst of this upheaval, geological catastrophe reshapes the world again. Massive flooding creates the Mediterranean Sea. Doggerland in northern Europe is submerged beneath what is now the North Sea. The world we know today begins to take shape. When the ice finally recedes and the dust settles, the people who emerge are the ancestors of the earliest civilizations of recorded history. The Hyborian Age is over. It's been completely forgotten, surviving only as a few half-remembered names in myth and legend. An advanced civilization, at the end of the Ice Age, destroyed by catastrophe and flooding, followed by a final cold period that drives survivors south, and then the slow emergence into the historical civilizations that we know. Howard wrote this in 1932. The question is, where did he get these ideas? To understand Howard's inspiration for his Hyborian Age essay, we need to go back to what scientists knew about the Ice Age in the early 20th century. In the late 1800s, geologists like James Geikie were proposing something that challenged the conventional understanding of the Ice Age. It wasn't a single continuous cold period. The Ice Age included warmer interglacial periods, times when the glaciers retreated and temperatures rose, before the cold returned again. By 1904, geologists had confirmed that there was a final cold snap right at the very end of the Ice Age, a last return to glacial conditions just before the current warm period began. It wouldn't receive the name Younger Dryas until a few years later, but the geological reality was well established during Howard's lifetime. And almost immediately, scholars began asking whether ancient myths might preserve memories of these climate shifts. Earlier, in 1885, William Fairfield Warren published Paradise Found, arguing that the Garden of Eden was located at the North Pole during a time when the Arctic was warm and habitable. He equated his hypothetical polar Eden with Atlantis, Hyperborea, and other mythical lands. In 1903, Indian scholar Balgandehar Tilak published The Arctic Home in the Vedas, arguing that the sacred hymns of the Rig Veda preserved memories of an advanced Aryan civilization that had flourished in the Arctic during an interglacial warm period. Now, a quick aside on the word Aryan. That's obviously a very loaded term today. In Tilak's time, Aryan was primarily a term referring to the speakers of the Indo-European family of languages. It derives from Sanskrit, and it was used by scholars to describe the people who migrated into the Indian subcontinent thousands of years ago. And yes, it of course was later co-opted and corrupted by the Nazis into a racial concept that had nothing to do with its original meaning. So, getting back to Tilak, when the glaciers returned, this Aryan civilization in the Arctic was destroyed, and the survivors were driven south in great migrations. He was arguing for an alternative origin for the Indo-European-speaking Aryans, whom most scholars believed originated in Central Asia. Tilak's timeline should sound familiar. He placed this Arctic civilization during an interglacial period around 10,000 to 8,000 BC, essentially the same time frame as the period right before the Younger Dryas. And his description of what happened, an advanced culture in a warm northern homeland destroyed by returning ice, with survivors migrating south, is essentially the plot of Howard's Hyborian Age essay. Tilak's ideas were unfortunately picked up by the growing Nordicist movement, which, as I mentioned, would take them to a very dark place within a few decades. But they also filtered into occult and theosophical thinking, where they reached popular audiences through writers who blended Eastern mysticism with Western esotericism. Howard probably never read Warren or Tilak directly, but these ideas of a northern civilization destroyed by encroaching ice reached him through at least two other sources. The first is Yogi Ramacharaka, a pseudonym for the American writer William Walker Atkinson. Atkinson published a series of popular books on yoga and Eastern philosophy that Howard is known to have read. Today, Atkinson's probably best known as the anonymous author of the pseudo-Hermetic text, the Kybalion. In 1909, his book, The Inner Teachings of the Philosophies and Religions of India, Atkinson wrote an interesting passage. Centuries upon centuries ago, the Aryan race descended upon the plains of India. From whence the Aryans came, historians are undecided, but the legends indicate that they came from some unknown land at the north. Some have supposed that they came from the region of the North Pole, the former conditions of which were quite different from the present conditions, while others have supposed that they were the survivors of some great nation whose home had been destroyed by some convulsion of nature. So the Aryan race, from an unknown land at the North Pole, survivors of a great nation destroyed by a convulsion of nature, destroyed by a catastrophe. That's Tilak's thesis, filtered through a popular occult book that we know Howard read. The second path is literary. Jack London, whom most people know as the author of Call of the Wild, was one of Howard's favorite authors. And his 1915 novel, The Star Rover, was one of Howard's favorite books. In it, the protagonist experiences past life memories, including one as a prehistoric barbarian from the north. I have lived many lives involved in the 1,000-year-long odysseys of the early drifts of men. Heavens, before I was of the flaxen-haired Aesir who dwelt in Asgard, and before I was of the red-haired Vanir who dwelt in Vanaheim. Long before those times I have memories of earlier drifts when, like thistledown before the breeze, we drifted south before the face of the descending polar ice caps. Flaxen-haired Aesir drifting south before the polar ice. That's not just the inspiration for the Hyborian Age, that's practically a scene from it. Howard's own Aesir and Vanir, driven south by the glacier ages at the end of the Hyborian Age, echo London almost directly. Howard even has a group of his Aesir settle near the Caspian Sea in Central Asia, where they eventually become the historical Aryans or Indo-Europeans. He was trying to reconcile the two different origin stories of the real-world Aryan migration theory of Tilak and that of mainstream scholars. Interestingly, Tilak also appears as a source in much more recent books. Graham Hancock cites Tilak in Fingerprints of the Gods and Magicians of the Gods. He's not a major source for Hancock, but he is one of them. Howard in 1932 and Hancock in 2015 were both drawing from a current of ideas about lost civilizations and catastrophic climate change that goes back over a century. Howard didn't know the term Younger Dryas, but the geological event it describes, a sudden return to glacial conditions at the end of the Ice Age, was known to science by 1904. And the mythological interpretation of that event, a lost civilization destroyed by returning ice, had been developed by Tilak and Warren and filtered through the Nordicist and occult traditions into popular literature well before Howard sat down to write the Hyborian Age. What Howard did was take all of these threads, the geological reality, the mythological interpretation, the literary models, and weave them into a fictional world that captured the same essential narrative that Hancock argues for today. An advanced civilization at the end of the Ice Age, destroyed by catastrophe and climate change, lost to history, surviving only in fragments of myth and legend. So what do we make of all this? Robert E. Howard wasn't just writing adventure stories, he was building a fictional prehistory grounded in real sources, real geological concepts, and real scholarly debates of his era. The Hyborian Age essay went through multiple drafts. He thought carefully about how his fictional world connected to the real one. And the result was a lost epoch that maps remarkably well onto what we now call the Younger Dryas and the years before that. Decades before most people had heard that term. Now, that doesn't mean that Hancock got his ideas from Howard. He didn't. But it does mean that the idea of an advanced civilization destroyed at the end of the Ice Age has been around for a lot longer than most people realize. Donnelly was arguing for it in 1882, Tilak was arguing for it in 1903, Howard fictionalized it in 1932, and Hancock has been arguing for it since 1995. They're all drawing from the same deep well of catastrophist thinking that goes back well over a century. And I think there's a reason this idea keeps coming back. The notion of a lost golden age, a great civilization that came before us and was wiped away by forces beyond its control. It's one of the most enduring stories humanity tells itself. You find it in Plato, in the Vedas, in the book of Genesis, in the mythology of both the Old and New World, and in pulp fiction magazines from the 1930s, and now on Netflix in 2022. Whether any of it turns out to be literally true is a question for geologists and archaeologists and speculative historians to sort out, but as a story, it's been compelling people for thousands of years. And I think it's worth understanding where these ideas come from and how they've traveled through time. And that's what this channel is about. Howard understood the power of that story better than almost anyone else. While scholars and mystics debated about lost civilizations, he did what he does best. He put a sword in Conan's hand and sent him forth, treading the jeweled thrones of the earth beneath his sandaled feet.